Hi, everyone. I am David Lipton from The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. Here is an AI generated conversation summarizing my ebook, which you can find on Amazon. The contents of the conversation are based entirely on what I have written. This AI generated podcast is experimental. Just imagine two of your friends discussing my ebook. Enjoy the conversation. My YouTube podcasts each week as they are released on every Wednesday.
Okay, so this David Lipton book, July 2030, The Reckoning.
Yeah.
It's a bit intense, right? Like, he paints this picture of the future where there are, get this, Chinese warships off the coast of Long Island on July 4th.
Yeah, I see what you mean. He definitely uses that fictional scenario to grab your attention.
Hmm.
But I think he's really trying to get us to think about the economic choices we're making today and how those choices could have some pretty dire consequences down the line.
Right, like that whole scene with the grandfather showing his granddaughter the graph of America's national debt just keeps replaying in my head.
It's a powerful image. And it's backed up by some pretty hard-hitting data, too. Like when he talks about how the national debt exploded between 1960 and 2015.
Yeah, like way more than the economy grew during that same period.
Exactly. It grew like, 73 times larger? Versus the economy only growing 34 times larger. It's a huge difference.
It's like we're on this crazy spending spree, but we're not really thinking about how we're going to pay for it all.
It's like putting all your expenses on a credit card and only paying the minimum balance. You might be able to keep up for a little while, but eventually that debt is going to catch up with you, and the interest alone will bury you.
And it's not just the government doing this, right? Lipton also talks about how much household debt has grown.
Oh, absolutely. He gives that example of the average American family in 2015, earning $32,500 a year, but spending almost $37,000.
And carrying, like, what was it, $181,500 in debt?
Something like that. Makes you think twice about that next online shopping spree, huh?
Seriously. But you know what really struck me? Lipton doesn't just focus on the numbers. He's saying this debt is actually a symptom of a much bigger problem.
Totally. He's talking about a shift in American values.
Right, like when he talks about that whole liberal democracy versus social democracy thing.
Yeah, those terms can be a bit confusing.
They totally throw me off sometimes.
Basically, think of liberal democracy as a system where individual rights and freedoms are the most important thing.
Okay, so kind of like a hands-off government.
Exactly. The government's role is to protect those freedoms, not necessarily to solve all your problems for you.
So where does that leave social democracy then?
Well, in a social democracy, the government takes on a more active role. It's not just about protecting individual freedom. It's about using the government to create a more socially equal society. So things like social programs, wealth redistribution, that kind of stuff.
So is Lipton saying that wanting social equality is a bad thing?
No, not necessarily. But he's definitely asking us to consider the trade-offs. Like if we're relying more on the government to create a more equal society, are we also giving up some of our own individual responsibility?
And maybe even our freedom to make our own choices, right?
Exactly. Even if those choices aren't always the best choices from like a societal point of view.
Okay, that makes sense. But like, who decides what's best anyway?
Well, that's a whole other can of worms. Right? But I think Lipton would say that in a liberal democracy, it should be up to the individual as much as possible.
And in a social democracy, it's more like the government gets to decide.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And he uses the example of the healthcare debate back in 2010. Remember that whole Affordable Care Act thing?
Oh, yeah. That was a whole big thing.
Exactly. And Lipton basically contrasts that kind of top-down, government-mandated approach to healthcare with a system that would be more bottom-up, driven by individuals making their own choices.
Interesting. So he's not necessarily saying one way is right or wrong.
Right. He's more interested in getting us to think about the pros and cons of each approach.
And how much control we're willing to give up in exchange for the government providing things like healthcare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe even more importantly,
Yeah.
who's actually paying for all of it?
Yeah.
Because someone always has to foot the bill, right?
That's what I mean about this whole thing making me kind of nervous, Like, it's easy to say, yeah, let's have all these great social programs, but then who's actually carrying the water, as Lipton puts it?
It's like we've gotten used to this idea that someone else will take care of everything.
Right.
Like the government or...
He's super rich. Yeah, exactly.
But Lipton's saying, hold on a sec. What about our own role in all of this? Like, what about taking some personal responsibility?
Yeah, it's like he's challenging this whole mindset of just expecting someone else to fix everything.
And he ties that back to what he calls this like great reversal in how we think as Americans.
Ooh, okay, I remember him talking about that.
Yeah. So he compares like Thomas Jefferson's vision of America,
Yeah.
limited government, individual freedom being the big thing, with someone like John Dewey, who thought the government should be a lot more involved in creating social equality.
So it's like, on one hand, you've got every man for himself, and on the other hand, it's let the government handle it.
It's more complicated than that, obviously. But Lipton's definitely saying we've moved a lot closer to that second thing over time.
And that might be part of the problem.
It's definitely something to think about.
Well, and he even brings up President Roosevelt, FDR.
Right. The guy who signed Social Security into law.
Yeah, and even even FDR was worried about people relying too much on the government.
He was all about individual initiative, like people taking care of themselves.
Which is kind of wild when you think about it. If he had his doubts back then,
Right.
shouldn't we at least be asking ourselves if we've gone too far?
For sure. I mean, Lipton seems to be saying that this dependence on government, it might actually be whittling away at our freedom.
It's like the more we rely on the government for healthcare and education and everything else, the less we feel like we can actually control our own lives,
It's that whole give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish thing.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like, at what point do we start to feel helpless because we're so used to being taken care of?
And it's so easy to just blame everything on politicians or whoever.
Oh, totally. It's like it's always someone else's fault.
But Lifton's really pushing us to look in the mirror and be like, okay, what about my choices? Am I part of the problem?
He doesn't want us to be passive about it. He wants us to be responsible citizens.
So, like, not just sitting around complaining, but actually doing something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the way Lipton sees it, freedom isn't just something you have. It's something you have to actively work for.
Ooh, okay. So he's not sugarcoating anything.
No, he's not.
Yeah.
But he's not all doom and gloom either.
So there's hope.
Oh, definitely.
Mm.
He lays out some pretty serious stuff in that book.
For sure.
But he also offers a way forward. And it all starts with asking ourselves some tough questions.
Like what? Give me an example. Like what kind of tough questions?
Well, for starters, like, what does it even mean to be a responsible citizen?
Mm-hmm.
In today's world,
Yeah.
What can I do in my own little corner of the world to actually make a difference?
Because it's easy to feel totally powerless in all of this, right? Like what can one person even do? It's almost like he's giving us a choice,
Yeah, like, here's where we are, folks. Do we keep heading down this road or...
Or do we finally take the wheel and steer ourselves in a different direction?
Wow. Exactly. But in order to make a different choice,
Yeah.
we have to first be aware that there is a choice to make,
Ooh, I like that.
because it's easy to just get swept along with things,
Oh, for sure.
But Lifton's reminding us that we're not powerless.
So, like, where do we even start? It feels like such a huge, overwhelming problem.
He doesn't lay out a step-by-step plan or anything,
Right.
but he does push us towards a different way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
Like remembering that freedom isn't some kind of guarantee.
It's not just handed to us.
Right. It's something we have to actively work at.
Huh. Okay. So more like a muscle you have to keep exercising.
Exactly. And just like any muscle, if you don't use it, you lose it.
So what can we actually do then as individuals?
Well, it starts with taking ownership. Instead of
Okay.
waiting for someone else to fix things,
The government.
or whoever. It's about asking yourself, what can I contribute? How can I be part of the solution? It's about taking responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for our families, our communities, all of it. And maybe even more importantly, it's about actually talking to each other about these things. Instead of just shouting at each other from our different sides, this book really makes you think about the big picture, like what kind of future are we creating with the choices we're making today? Not just for ourselves, but for our kids and grandkids and everyone who comes after us. It's a call to action. Lipton's challenging us to step up and really think about what we want our legacy to be. So as you go about your week, keep those questions in mind. Are we living up to that ideal of individual responsibility? Are we carrying our own water, so to speak? Because the answers matter, not just for America, but for everyone.